The GPS was turned off. Two men no one recognized were moving the boat, and it was heading straight for Florida. That is how this case broke open again. Not through a press conference, not through a charge, through a daughter on Mother's Day, watching a live stream of her missing mother's sailboat being steered out of the Bahamas by strangers, with the tracking signal dark, and no one from law enforcement bothering to call her. Hours after that video was posted, the United States Coast Guard intercepted the vessel. They took it into custody before it could reach shore. And now the boat named Soulmate is sitting at a federal station in Fort Pierce, Florida, while investigators with the Coast Guard Investigative Service begin the work of finding out what it is hiding. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old. She was from Michigan. She was a mother, a sailor, a woman her daughter described as her #1 supporter. For years, she and her husband, Brian Hooker, 58, lived aboard a 47-foot sailboat they named Soulmate. They documented that life on social media under the name Sailing Hookers. Videos of sea turtles, sunsets from the deck, island channels in clear water. From the outside, it looked exactly like what they said it was. A dream retirement, built on wind and salt in each other. But private messages Lynette sent to a friend in January 2024 tell a different story. In those messages, obtained exclusively by CBS News, Lynette wrote to a fellow boater named Marnie Stevenson that things had gotten, in her words, real bad. She wrote that she could not be out there with him. She said their marriage of 21 years had lasted only 6 weeks of cruising. She said she had left Brian and gone to stay with her mother in Florida. She said they had decided to call it quits. She said she was not going back. Less than a month later, she was back. By late February 2024, Lynette replied to Marnie's messages with heart emojis and a thumbs up. The reconciliation was complete. 13 months later, on the night of April 4, 2026, Lynette Hooker was on an 8-foot dinghy in the dark waters off Elbow Cay in the Bahamas, and then she was gone. Before we get to the night of April 4th, we need to understand the world these two people were living in, because the context of a disappearance is never separate from the disappearance itself. Brian and Lynette Hooker were not occasional sailors. They were liveaboards, people who had made the ocean their permanent address. The Soulmate was not a vacation boat. It was their home, their kitchen, their living room, their bedroom, and the only physical space either of them occupied for weeks and months at a time. People who live this way describe it as liberating and as suffocating, sometimes in the same breath. There is no escaping each other on a 47-foot boat. Every argument, every silence, every tension that would dissolve in a house because one person could walk to a different room stays trapped on a boat. It circulates. It compounds. Experienced sailing couples speak about this openly. The sea tests a relationship in ways that land never could. Blaine Stevenson, who met the Hookers while sailing near Bradenton, Florida in 2023, later told CBS News that Lynette had trusted Brian with her life out there. His words, they were not abstract, they were literal. A woman who cannot swim to shore, who depends on the equipment her husband maintains, who travels to waters where emergency services are measured in hours rather than minutes, is trusting that man with her life in the most immediate sense possible. Stevenson's message in the aftermath of Lynette's disappearance was pointed. He said to Brian Hooker, indirectly, through the camera, that Lynette's family had trusted you with their loved one, and you didn't live up to it. Brian Hooker's attorneys have not responded to that characterization. The Hookers chronicled their sailing life under the name Sailing Hookers on social media. The account showed the couple navigating Caribbean waters, stopping at islands, maintaining the boat. To followers, it looked like adventure. To Lynette's daughter, it looked like her mother disappearing into a life that concerned her. Carly Aylesworth has said she did not believe her mother was as experienced at sea as Brian presented her to be. She described her mother as someone who had adapted to the sailing life because Brian wanted it, not necessarily because it was what Lynette would have chosen on her own. None of this constitutes evidence of a crime, but it establishes the reality of the relationship that was operating in the background of what happened on April 4th. Two people, married for 25 years, living in close quarters on a vessel in foreign waters with a documented history of conflict, and with Lynette herself having expressed, just over a year before her disappearance, that she could not be out there with him. Here is what the official record shows. Elbow Cay is a small island in the Elbow chain of the northern Bahamas. It sits at the edge of a protected harbor called Hopetown, known for its red and white striped lighthouse, its pastel-colored cottages, and the tight community of sailors who pass through it. The couple had been mooring the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay, just offshore from Elbow Cay and Hopetown. On the evening of April 4th, according to Brian Hooker's account to Bahamian authorities, he and Lynette had dinner ashore at the Elbow Inn in Hopetown. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, They boarded the dinghy to return to the Soulmate. What Brian Hooker told police happened next is the center of everything. According to his account, as documented in police reports reviewed by CBS News, CNN, and Fox News Digital, the conditions on the water changed rapidly after they left the dock. High winds, choppy seas. In those conditions, Lynette fell from the dinghy. She was wearing the engine's safety lanyard, a kill switch cord designed to cut power to the motor if pulled free. When she went over the side, she took that cord with her. The engine died. Brian says he threw her a flotation device. He says he saw her swimming toward shore. Then the current took her. Without engine power, he says he paddled toward land. The dinghy eventually drifted on its own. Police records indicate it washed ashore near Marsh Harbor. Brian Hooker arrived at the Marsh Harbor boatyard at approximately 4 in the morning on April 5th. He told someone at the boatyard his wife was missing. That person contacted authorities. 7:30 in the evening, 4 in the morning, 8.5 hours. Remember those numbers. The Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue launched a search by sea. The U.S. Coast Guard joined with aerial assets. 3 days later, on April 7th, the operation shifted from search and rescue to search and recovery. That distinction matters. It means authorities no longer believed Lynette Hooker was likely to be found alive. She has not been found. Now let us look at the questions the official account does not answer. The first question is about the safety lanyard. A kill switch cord on an outboard motor is a piece of equipment designed to be worn by the operator of the boat, the person at the helm. If the operator is thrown overboard, the cord pulls free, the switch trips, the engine cuts off. Brian Hooker was operating the dinghy. That means the lanyard should have been clipped to Brian Hooker. But according to his account to police, it was Lynette, the passenger, who was wearing it. She was not at the helm. She was not the operator. When she fell, the cord left with her, the engine died, and Brian was left without power. Why was the kill switch cord on the passenger? This question has not been publicly answered. Brian Hooker's attorneys have not addressed it. Bahamian investigators have not commented on it publicly. But in any mechanical reconstruction of what happened on that dinghy, the placement of the safety lanyard is not a minor detail. It is the reason the engine died, and the reason it was where it was has not been explained. The second question is about the timeline. 8.5 hours to travel approximately 4 miles. The Sea of Abaco, the body of water between Elbow Cay and Marsh Harbor, is not a protected lagoon. It can develop significant chop and high winds. Paddling a powerless 8-foot inflatable across that distance in the dark in difficult conditions is hard. Experienced sailors in the area put the maximum realistic time at roughly 3 to 4 hours under the most difficult paddling conditions. That still leaves 4 to 5 hours unaccounted for. What was Brian Hooker doing during that time? Where was the dinghy? Was the Soulmate moving? The navigation record of the Soulmate may answer that last question. Modern marine chart plotters log GPS coordinates continuously. If the Soulmate moved on the night of April 4th, that record would exist. Investigators now have the boat. They have the equipment. They will look. The third question is about the weather. Brian Hooker described high winds and choppy seas, severe enough to knock Lynette from the dinghy. Multiple boat captains familiar with the local waters told CBS News that the weather that night was not bad. A friend of the couple described the dinghy as underpowered for the conditions, but did not corroborate the claim that conditions were extreme. Official marine weather data for the Abaco Islands on the evening of April 4, 2026 has not been publicly released, but investigators have it. And if it contradicts Brian Hooker's account of the conditions, that contradiction becomes a foundational problem for his entire narrative. Here is another question no one has answered publicly. Brian Hooker's friend Daniel Danforth told CBS News that the couple always had their phones with them. He said he wondered why Brian's phone had not worked that night, or why they had not had their phones on the boat. This is worth examining carefully. A smartphone with GPS produces a location record. If Brian Hooker's phone was active between 7:30 in the evening and 4 in the morning, it placed him somewhere. If it was off, that itself is a data point. Law enforcement in possession of a cell carrier subpoena can determine whether the phone was on, where it pinged, when it went dark, and when it came back online. Bahamian authorities executed a search warrant early in the investigation and removed from the Soulmate a digital video recorder, digital tablets, and cell phone-related equipment. Those devices are presumably part of the evidence record. The Coast Guard, as a federal agency with access to the full resources of the federal government, including the FBI when requested, can extend that digital analysis significantly. Forensic scientist Joseph Scott Morgan told Fox News Digital that investigators examining the Soulmate would most likely be looking for large focal areas of blood. His words, he said investigators would be looking for dried blood, for signs that any area of the boat had been sanitized or cleaned, and for any trace evidence indicating a violent act took place on board. He also acknowledged the challenge. The boat was seized more than a month after Lynette disappeared. Anyone who had been aboard in that time could have introduced or removed material. Time and exposure to the marine environment degrade biological evidence. He called it, in his words, a ticking clock situation. The truth, he said, could be washed away. Maritime law expert Kenneth Engerond, an adjunct professor at the University of Houston Law Center, told Fox News Digital that the Coast Guard did not need a warrant to seize the Soulmate. Because it is an American-flagged vessel, the Coast Guard has the absolute authority to seize any vessel they believe is involved in criminal activity. He also noted that the United States is, in his words, well within its rights to assert a violation of the murder statute and has jurisdiction over violent acts committed on a United States vessel, even if those acts occurred in foreign waters. That is the legal foundation for what is happening now. A federal criminal investigation with the potential to result in a murder charge, if the evidence supports it. Let us now look at the history between Brian and Lynette Hooker that investigators would have assembled before any of this happened. Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter and Brian's stepdaughter, has been the most consistent and specific voice raising concerns about her stepfather from the earliest days of the investigation. She told CNN that the couple's marriage was turbulent and at times physically violent. She said her mother confided in her that Brian had choked her. She said that in January 2026, approximately 3 months before Lynette disappeared, her mother told her Brian had threatened to throw her off the boat during a fight the previous year, a threat to throw her off the boat, in a case where she is said to have gone off a boat. Aylesworth also told Fox News Digital that she had personally witnessed Brian choke one of his daughters, and that the family had been to court over it. Brian Hooker's attorneys have denied all of these allegations. There is also the 2015 police report from Kentwood, Michigan. According to that document, reviewed by CNN, Lynette Hooker was taken into custody for assault and battery. Brian Hooker told responding officers she had struck him multiple times. He had a swollen, bloody nose. Charges were not filed because there was insufficient evidence to establish who had started the confrontation. Both parties accused the other. The 2015 incident does not establish a clean narrative in either direction, but it establishes that investigators looking into this marriage found a documented history of physical conflict going back more than a decade. Lynette Hooker's mother, Darlene Hamlet, told the Associated Press in the early days of the investigation that she had not heard from her son-in-law in several days. A grandmother, waiting. Now the timeline in full. April 4th, 2026, approximately 7:30 in the evening. Brian and Lynette Hooker leave the Abaco Inn in Hopetown aboard their 8-foot dinghy, heading toward the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay. According to Brian Hooker's account, Lynette falls overboard shortly after departure in rough conditions. April 5, 2026. Approximately 4 out in the morning, Brian Hooker arrives at the Marsh Harbor Boatyard and reports his wife missing through a person at the boatyard. Search operations begin within hours. The Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue deploy by sea. April 5th, 2026. Evening, approximately 8 to 8:30. Brian Hooker calls Carly Aylesworth. He tells her, in a tone she describes to CNN as matter of fact, that her mother is missing and has been missing since the night before. He tells her they will come up to see her soon. Then he ends the call abruptly. April 6, 2026. Brian Hooker leaves Carly Aylesworth a voicemail. He tells her that Hopetown Search and Rescue found the flotation device he says he threw to Lynette. He tells her investigators can now focus on a smaller search area. The voicemail is shared publicly by Aylesworth. April 7, 2026. Search and rescue operations are officially reclassified as search and recovery. The U.S. Coast Guard joins with aerial assets. The State Department confirms it is providing consular assistance. April 8, 2026. Bahamian authorities take Brian Hooker into custody. The Royal Bahamas Police Force confirms the detention is based on what they describe as some probable cause. Brian Hooker is transported to Nassau and later to the Grand Bahama Police Station in Freeport. His attorney, Terrell Butler, states he was initially interviewed as a witness before being taken into formal custody. April 10, 2026. A Bahamian legal deadline passes. Brian Hooker's attorney confirms investigators are questioning his client specifically about a potential charge of causing harm resulting in death. Authorities obtain an extension, giving them until Monday evening to make a decision on charges. April 13, 2026. Brian Hooker is released from custody. The Royal Bahamas Department of Public Prosecutions recommends no charges be filed at that time, pending further investigation. The investigation is not closed. Brian Hooker leaves the Bahamas. His attorney states he is traveling to the United States to be with his terminally ill mother. May 5, 2026. The Coast Guard Investigative Service releases images of a mystery sailboat moored near the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th. Investigators ask the public to help identify the owner or occupants. According to a Coast Guard memo obtained by CBS News, the owners or occupants of that vessel may have information relevant to the investigation. May 9, 2026. The Soulmate departs Marsh Harbor in the Bahamas. It is being moved by two men. Carly Aylesworth notices. She records a video. She says neither of the men is Brian. She says she has never seen them before. She says they turned off the GPS. She posts the video on Mother's Day. May 10, 2026. The U.S. Coast Guard intercepts the Soulmate while it is en route to the United States. The vessel is taken into federal custody. May 11, 2026. Drone footage obtained by CBS News shows the Soulmate docked at the Fort Pierce Coast Guard Station in Florida. The federal investigation has the boat. Let us also look at what the forensic examination of the Soulmate may realistically be able to establish, and what it may not, because the expectations around forensic evidence in maritime cases require some grounding in reality. Joseph Scott Morgan, a forensic scientist who spoke to Fox News Digital after the seizure, was direct about what investigators are likely looking for: large focal areas of blood, dried blood, signs that any area of the boat had been cleaned or sanitized, any trace evidence suggesting a violent act took place aboard. He was equally direct about the challenge. The boat was seized more than a month after Lynette disappeared. In that time, an unknown number of people may have been aboard. The marine environment is hostile to biological evidence. Salt air, humidity, sun exposure, and water contact all degrade organic material. The longer the gap between an incident and forensic examination, the more difficult the examination becomes. Morgan described it plainly. The hourglass had been running for over a month. What remains of the evidence inside it depends on what happened, where it happened aboard the vessel, and how much the environment has compromised it in the intervening weeks. Despite those challenges, the seizure of the Soulmate is still the most significant development in this investigation. Here is why. Physical evidence, even degraded, can be detected with modern forensic technology. Luminol and other chemical reagents can reveal the presence of blood in quantities invisible to the naked eye and can detect traces that have been cleaned. DNA analysis can be performed on microscopic biological samples. The electronic systems aboard the vessel, unlike human memory or organic tissue, do not degrade. A chart plotter that logged GPS coordinates on the night of April 4th still contains those coordinates. A VHF radio with a digital selective calling system still contains a log of any calls made. A satellite phone still carries its call history. These records are not affected by time, weather, or cleaning products. Maritime law expert Kenneth Engerand was clear on the jurisdictional foundation for all of this. The Soulmate is an American flagged vessel. That means the United States has jurisdiction over crimes committed aboard it, even in international or foreign waters. The Coast Guard does not need to defer to the Bahamas when examining an American boat. The United States is, in Engerand's words, well within its rights to assert a violation of the murder statute and has jurisdiction over violent acts committed on a United States vessel. If the evidence aboard the Soulmate supports a federal charge, federal prosecutors working with the Coast Guard Investigative Service can bring that charge in a U.S. federal court, regardless of what Bahamian authorities have or have not done. That is the legal architecture underneath this investigation. And the Coast Guard Investigative Service, whose agents are sworn federal law enforcement officers working directly with the Department of Justice, is the agency executing it. That detail about the GPS being turned off deserves specific attention. When Carly Aylesworth recorded her video on Mother's Day, she noted that the two men moving the Soulmate had turned off the vessel's GPS. Maritime GPS tracking is not something that is routinely disabled. Vessels in transit with legitimate purposes leave their tracking active. It allows other mariners to see them on navigation charts. It allows port authorities to monitor traffic. Disabling it serves no practical purpose in normal sailing. What it does do is make the vessel invisible to anyone monitoring its position remotely, including a stepdaughter watching an app on her phone, and including federal investigators watching known vessels connected to active criminal investigations. The Coast Guard described their interception of the Soulmate as an interdiction. They had the authority, they exercised it, and now the boat is in their hands. Two theories define this case as it currently stands. Theory 1 is that this was a tragic accident. Under this theory, Brian Hooker's account is accurate. Conditions deteriorated. Lynette fell overboard. The engine failed because of the lanyard. He could not reach her. He paddled to shore. He reported the incident. The flotation device was found where he said it would be. The Bahamian prosecutors reviewed the evidence and found no basis for charges. Brian Hooker is a grieving widower whose behavior has been misread and whose account has been unfairly scrutinized. The evidence that supports this theory, the Department of Public Prosecutions declined to charge. No forensic evidence of violence has been publicly identified. The flotation device recovery corroborates at least one element of his account. Carly Aylesworth, who retraced the dinghy route herself, told NewsNation she found no direct contradictions in Brian Hooker's account of the path taken. The evidence that challenges this theory, the 8.5-hour timeline gap, the safety lanyard on the passenger, not the operator, the disputed weather conditions, the private messages from Lynette describing fear, the domestic violence allegations, the departure from the Bahamas rather than continuing the search, the GPS being disabled as the Soulmate was moved, the fact that a federal criminal investigation was opened almost immediately. Theory 2 is that something happened on that boat that Brian Hooker has not disclosed. Under this theory, Lynette Hooker's death was not accidental. The sequence of events described to authorities was constructed to explain her absence in a way that would appear consistent with an accident at sea. The evidence that supports this theory, the safety lanyard question, the timeline gap, the disputed weather, Lynette's own words to her friend that she could not be out there with him, her daughter's detailed and specific allegations about threats and prior violence, including a specific threat to throw her off the boat, the Coast Guard opening a criminal investigation before Bahamian authorities had even completed their review, the unexplained movement of the Soulmate out of the Bahamian jurisdiction with GPS disabled during an active federal criminal probe. The evidence that challenges this theory, no charge has been filed. No forensic evidence of violence has been publicly confirmed. The 2015 police report cuts in multiple directions. Lynette chose to return to Brian and continue sailing with him, and the forensic window is narrowing with every passing day. The evidence supports parts of each theory and leaves critical gaps in both. That is the honest assessment. There is no public evidence that definitively establishes what happened. There is significant and specific evidence that demands the investigation continue. Forensic nurse and investigator Shannon Fisher told NewsNation that conclusions in cases like this are not based on theory or opinion, but on whether independent sources of evidence, physical findings, digital data, environmental conditions, and verified timelines converge on a single consistent explanation. Her words, "Until that alignment occurs, the investigation remains focused on testing each element of the reported narrative against the available evidence." That is exactly where this investigation is now, testing each element, and the Soulmate is the most important element left to test, where the case stands today. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service is conducting an active federal criminal investigation into the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. CGIS agents are sworn federal law enforcement officers who work directly with the Department of Justice. The Soulmate, a 47-foot American-flagged sailboat, is in federal custody at the Fort Pierce Coast Guard Station in Florida. Forensic examination of the vessel is expected. Investigators are actively conducting witness interviews. The mystery sailboat that was moored near the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th has not been publicly identified. The owner or occupants of that vessel have not been publicly confirmed as having been located or interviewed. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime in any jurisdiction. He is not in custody. His location has not been publicly confirmed. His attorney has not responded to questions about whether he is cooperating with the Coast Guard investigation. Lynette Hooker remains a missing person. Her body has not been recovered. Her family has received no update from investigators. On Mother's Day, Carly Aylesworth recorded a video. She said it was the first Mother's Day without her mom. She said it was hard knowing her mother was not a text away anymore. She said she was watching the Soulmate move. She said the men on it were strangers. She said the GPS was off. Hours later, the Coast Guard had the boat. Let us also consider, briefly, the question of the mystery sailboat, because it may prove to be one of the most important threads in this entire investigation. On May 5th, 2026, 1 week before the Soulmate was seized, the Coast Guard Investigative Service published images on social media of an unidentified sailboat that had been moored near the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay on or around April 4th. The post stated clearly that the owners or occupants of that vessel may have information relevant to the CGIS investigation. Investigators invited tips to be submitted through the CGIS Tips app, available on both Apple and Android, and stated that tips could be submitted anonymously. The significance of this appeal cannot be overstated. Aunt Pat's Bay is a mooring area. It is not a dock. Boats anchor there and stay for days or weeks. People live aboard their vessels in that bay, much as Brian and Lynette Hooker were living aboard the Soulmate. If another boat was moored nearby, the people aboard it had eyes and ears on that anchorage. They may have seen the couple leave in the dinghy on the evening of April 4th. They may have observed whether the Soulmate moved during the night. They may have heard sounds from the water or from the sailboat in the hours after Lynette is said to have gone overboard. They may have noticed, or they may have noticed nothing. But investigators want to know either way. The fact that the Coast Guard made this appeal publicly, rather than simply seeking the information through private channels, suggests they had not yet been able to identify the boat through other means. Vessel registration databases, marina records, and AIS transponder logs, the automatic identification system that most boats over a certain size are required to broadcast, would normally allow investigators to identify a vessel in a known location. If the Coast Guard needed public help to find the mystery boat, it may mean the vessel was not broadcasting AIS, was not registered in a database that investigators could easily access, or that its identity could not be established from the images alone. As of the most recent public reporting, the identity of the occupants of that vessel has not been publicly confirmed. There is one more detail that has received less coverage than it deserves, and it concerns Brian Hooker's visit to the police station in Freeport on April 14, 2026. Photographs obtained by Fox News Digital show Brian Hooker arriving at the Central Police Station in Freeport, one day after his release from custody, accompanied by his attorney, Terrell Butler. He was there, according to the available reporting, to retrieve his wedding ring and watch. He had been released the previous evening, had not spoken to media, and returned the following morning to collect personal items. There is nothing inherently suspicious about wanting to recover a wedding ring, but the optics of that moment, a man whose wife has been missing for 9 days, returning to the police station where he was just released to retrieve jewelry while she is still unaccounted for in the waters of the Bahamas, is an image that carries weight, not legal weight, not evidentiary weight, but the kind of weight that investigators, families, and the public absorb when trying to understand who a person is and how they respond in a crisis. Brian Hooker has not spoken publicly since the early days of the investigation. His attorneys have spoken for him. They have been consistent. He denies wrongdoing. He is heartbroken. He was cooperative. He wanted to search for his wife. The U.S.-based attorney, Crystal Marie Hauser, asked the public to give him the benefit of the doubt and to consider that people handle grief differently. Those are legitimate points. Grief is not uniform. Shock does not produce a predictable behavior pattern. People who have done nothing wrong are sometimes the people who look most suspicious in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. All of that is true. It is also true that the evidence in this case presents questions that have not been answered, and answering them is not a matter of preference or of benefit of the doubt. It is a matter of evidence. Forensic nurse Shannon Fisher put it precisely when she told NewsNation that conclusions in cases like this are not based on theory or opinion, but on whether independent sources of evidence converge on a single, consistent explanation. Physical findings, digital data, environmental conditions, verified timelines. When those elements align, an explanation emerges. When they do not align, the investigation continues. Right now, in this case, the question of whether those elements align has not been resolved. The forensic examination of the Soulmate may resolve it. The testimony of the occupants of the mystery sailboat may resolve it. The navigation records, the call logs, the biological evidence aboard the vessel, the weather data for the night of April 4th, these are the instruments through which resolution comes. Not through assertion, through evidence. What investigators find aboard that vessel will either support or challenge the account Brian Hooker has given since April 5th. The navigation logs do not grieve. The digital records do not feel shock. The surfaces of a boat do not choose what to remember. They hold what happened if enough of it remains. This isn't just a story. It's a real life, a real family, and a case that may still have answers waiting to be found. The search for truth continues.